Chapter 14 of the Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness. Recording by Joseph Tabler. The Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness, by Horace Kephart. Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Blazes, Survey Lines, Natural Signs of Direction. The chief difficulty in forest travel, especially in flat lands that are heavily timbered, is the lack of natural outlooks from which one could get a view of distant landmarks. Although there are plenty of marks in the woods themselves by which a trained woodsman can follow a route that he traversed not long before, yet these signs are forever changing, vanishing, being superseded by others. Not only do new growths spring up, but old ones are swept away, sometimes suddenly as by flood or fire. Hence, when men have once picked out a course through the woods that they intend to follow again, they leave permanent marks along the way for future guidance. The most conspicuous and durable waymarks that can easily be made are blazes on the trees. It is of no little consequence to a traveler in the wilds that he should know something about blazes and the special uses made of them in the backwoods. On a thin-barked tree a blaze is made by a single downward stroke, the axe being held almost parallel with the trunk. But if the bark is thick, an upward and a downward clip must be made, perhaps several of them, because in any case the object usually is to expose a good-sized spot of the whitish sapwood of the tree, which, set in the dark framework of the outer bark, is a staring mark in the woods, sure to attract attention, at least while fresh. Outside of white birch forests, white is the most conspicuous color in the woods until snow falls. If a blaze is made merely on the outer bark, it will not show so plainly by contrast. This kind of blaze, however, may be preferred for some purposes, for example, by a trapper who does not want to call everybody's attention to where his traps are set. A bark blaze has the peculiarity that it lasts unaltered, so long as the bark itself endures, preserving its original outlines and distinctness, no matter how much the tree may grow. But if a wound, however slight, be made through the bark into the sapwood of the tree, so that the sap, which is the tree's blood, exudes, a healing process will at once set in, and the injury in time will be covered over. So as soon as a blaze is made that exposes the wood, the tree begins at once to cover up its scar. This is a slow process. First the edges of the cut will widen, then a sort of lip of smooth new inner bark will form, and this will gradually spread inward over the gash. Once this new skin has formed, the wound will be covered by new annual layers of wood, as well as by new outer bark. Years after the blaze was made, nothing will show on the surface but a slight scar, a sign that takes practiced eyes to detect and read. Old blazes that are completely grown over can only be proved by chopping into the wood until they are uncovered. The original marks of the axe are then plainly visible, and the age of a blaze can be determined to within at most a few years by the number of rings that have grown over it, except in the case of tupelo and winged elm trees, the fiber of which is very irregular. A blaze always remains at its original height above the ground, and where two or more spots have been cut in the same tree, they will always stand at the same distance apart. This is because a tree increases its height and girth only by building on top of the previous growth, not by stretching it. An old line of blazes on spruce or pine trees is much easier to follow than if made on non-resinous trees, because the resin deposited by the oozing sap leaves a very noticeable and durable mark. Similarly, when an inscription has been penciled or painted on a fresh blaze on a pine tree, the sap glazes over the mark and makes it almost imperishable. In searching out a line of blazes, one should keep his eyes glancing horizontally along a plane about breast high, because that is the height at which surveyors leave their marks, and others usually follow the custom, unless the line has been spotted by a man on horseback or from a boat during time of overflow. When a blazed line turns abruptly, so that a person following might otherwise overrun it, a long slash is made on that side of the tree which faces the new direction. It is difficult to follow a line of blazes when snow is falling, because the wind drives the damp flakes against the tree, where they adhere and must be brushed away to find the blaze. Now, it is often of much consequence to a traveler to remember such facts as these. For example, there is nothing more common in the annals of misadventure than for a novice to stray off on a deer trail, or in southern forests on a cattle trail, which, although seductively plain at first, leads nowhere in particular, and soon dwindles to nothing. When undecided, look for blazes along the path. In heavily timbered regions, such as we are now considering, any trail that is, or ever has been, used as a highway by white men is almost sure to have been blazed. Again, it is often of moment to determine, when one strikes a strange trail, what its nature is, for what purpose it was made, and thus be able to figure out whether it is likely to lead directly to a settlement or camp. This ought not to be very difficult when one knows what classes of men have preceded him in this particular forest. Generally speaking, a line spotted in a wide forest that as yet has no farmers' clearings is likely to have been made by either 1. a trapper, 2. a lumberman or timber looker, or 3. a surveyor. A trapper's line usually leads from one stream or lake to another. The blazes are likely to be inconspicuous. The line probably meanders a good deal, but not to escape ordinary obstacles, not disdaining a steep climb for a short cut. Along its course, at intervals of 8 or 10 miles, there are probably rude shanties containing supplies, or the ruins of such shacks, if the line is no longer used. Such a line does not lead to any settlement, and can be seldom of any use to a wayfarer. Timber lookers may or may not leave evidence of their wanderings. More likely not, for like other seekers after bonanzas, they may have excellent reasons for not doing so. At most, they would merely leave the easiest route for a prospective road from the river to some bunch of timber. Where logging operations have already begun, then, wherever a stump stands, it will not be hard to determine the direction in which the logs were twitched to the nearby lizard road, where they were loaded on lizards, forks of timber used as sleds, or on wagons, and dragged to the river or sawmill. I am assuming primitive operations in a remote wilderness. The lizard road was blazed when first laid out. Logs are never dragged uphill if that can be avoided. Consequently, the trend of the road will be downhill or on a level. The lizard road will show ruts, trees barked along the way by whiffle trees, and other characteristic marks. Once the old lumber camp site is reached, even though it be deserted, the signs of an old tote road can be discerned, leading toward a settlement from which supplies were transported. A surveyor's line is always absolutely straight. When it reaches an impassable obstacle, such as a swamp or a cliff, an offset is made to right or left, but this offset is also a straight line, at right angles, of course, to the main one, the latter being continued in the original direction as soon as the obstacle has been passed. For this and other reasons that presently will appear, a surveyor's line can never be mistaken for any other. If one understands the mere rudiments of public surveying, and has a township map of the locality he is in, then whenever he runs across a section line, he can soon tell just where he is, and what is the most direct route to any other point in the neighborhood. In those parts of the United States that are still wild enough to offer attractions to campers, the method of numbering, subdividing, and marking township sections is usually that adopted by the public land surveys, a brief description of which follows. The public lands of the United States are generally divided into townships of 6 miles square, 23,040 acres, as nearly as convergence of meridians allows. A township is subdivided into 36 sections, each 1 mile square, as nearly as may be, which as a general rule are numbered as shown in the first diagram here given, and are legally subdivided as indicated in the second diagram. The first diagram is 6 by 6, numbered 1 through 36, 1 in the upper right corner, 36 is the bottom right corner. Plate 2 has the subdivision of a township, the outside lines being the township and range lines. Sections are divided into half sections, quarter sections, etc. End of reader's note. Starting from an established corner, all trees that stand directly on the line of survey have 2 chops or notches cut on each side of them without any other marks whatever. These are called sight trees or line trees, sometimes fore and aft trees, since there may not be enough trees actually intercepting the line of sight to make such a line conspicuous. A sufficient number of other trees standing within not more than 2 rods of the line on either side of it are blazed on 2 sides diagonally, or quartering toward the line, or coinciding in direction with the line where the trees stand very near it. Blazes are not omitted where trees 2 inches or more in diameter are found. Bushes on or near the line are bent at right angles therewith, and receive a blow with the axe at the usual height of blazes from the ground, sufficient to leave them in a bent position, but not to prevent growth. When the course is obstructed by swamps, lakes, or other impassable objects, the line is prolonged across by taking the necessary right angle offsets, or by traverse, etc., until the line is regained on the opposite side. At the intersection of lines on both margins, a post is set for a witness point, and 2 trees opposite sides of the line are here marked with a blaze and notch facing the post. But on the margins of navigable rivers or lakes, the trees are marked with a number of the fractional section, township, and range. Arabic figures are used exclusively. The following corners are marked: 1. For township boundaries at intervals of every 6 miles. 2. For section boundaries at intervals of every mile. 3. For quarter section boundaries at intervals of 1/2 mile, with exceptions. 4. Meander corners, wherever lines intersect banks of rivers, etc., directed to be meandered. Witness corners bear the same marks as those of true corners, plus the letters WC. 4 different modes of perpetuating corners are employed in the following order of choice. 1. Corner trees, when a tree not less than 5 inches in diameter stands immediately in place. 2. Stone corners, where procurable. These must be at least 14 inches long. Stones 14 to 18 inches long are set 2/3, and larger ones 3/4 of their length in the ground. 3. Posts and witnesses. The latter are trees adjacent in opposite directions, each with a smooth blaze facing the corner with a notch at the lower end, and with the number of township, range, and section. Below this, near the ground on a smooth blaze, are marked the letters BT, bearing tree. Blazes may be omitted from smooth-barked trees. Where there are no trees, witness pits are dug, 2 feet square and at least 1 foot deep. 4. Posts and mounds. A mound is erected around the corner post, and a marked stone or some charcoal or a charred stake is deposited a foot below the surface on the side toward which the line runs. Township corner post. This projects 2 feet above the ground, the projecting part being squared. When the corner is common to 4 townships, the post is set cornerwise to the lines, and on each flattened side is marked the number of the township, range, and section, thus: T1S, R2W, S36. This example reads Township 1 south, range 2 west, section 36. 6 notches are cut on each of the 4 edges. If the post is on a closing corner where the line does not continue straight ahead, but is offset to allow for convergence of meridians, This closing corner being common to 2 townships south of the base line, 6 notches are cut on each of the east, south, and west sides, but none on the north, and CC closing corner is cut on the surface. The position of all township corner posts is witnessed by 4 bearing trees or pits or stones. Bearing trees are marked like the post, stones are merely notched. Section corners. When the corner is common to 4 sections, the post is set cornerwise to the lines, the numbers of sections being marked on the surfaces facing them, and on the northeast face the number of township and range is inscribed. All mile posts on township lines have as many notches on the 2 corresponding edges as they are miles distant from the respective township corners. Section posts in the interior of a township have as many notches on the south and east edges as they are miles from the south and east boundaries of the township, but none on the north and west edges. All section posts are witnessed as above. Section cornerstones are merely notched. Quarter section corners. These are merely marked 1/4 and witnessed. Red chalk is used to make marks more conspicuous. In older sections of the United States and in Canada, other systems of marks may be used, but the general principles are much the same. On arriving in a new country, it pays to inquire about the methods of marking survey lines that are there in vogue. Are there any natural signs of direction that will give a man his bearings when the sky is obscured? This is a question on which there has been much discussion in the sportsman's press. Everyone has heard, for example, that moss grows thickest on the north side of a tree, and nearly everyone has heard this as flatly contradicted. The general opinion seems to be that such signs are important if true. The Indians and white frontiersmen of fiction never have any difficulty in finding their way by noting where moss grows thickest on the trees. But when our novel reader goes into the woods, compass in hand, and puts the thing to actual test, he will probably be disgusted to find that in densely shaded primeval forest there seems to be no regularity in the growth of moss, one tree having a thick layer of it on the north side, another on the east, another on the south, and so on. He is then ready to declare that the old saying is a fake. I shall endeavor to show that there is more in this matter than is generally credited. There are certain signs of direction that are fairly constant in given regions, so that by their help a native, or even a stranger who has good powers of observation, some patience, and a fair knowledge of the life habits of trees and plants, can steer his course without a compass, and without help from sun or stars. But let us clearly understand what is involved in this use of nature's compass marks. No universal rule can be established from such signs as the growth of moss on trees, the preponderance of branches on one side of a tree, or the direction toward which the tips of tall conifers point. Such things are modified by prevailing winds, shadows, and shelter of nearby mountains, depth or sparseness of forest growth, and other local conditions. Everywhere exceptions will be found. If there were none, it would be child's play, not woodcraft, to follow such signs. No sign is infallible. A botanist can tell the north side of a steep hill from the south side by examining the plant growth, but no one plant of itself will tell him the story. So a woodsman works out his course by a system of averaging the signs around him. It is this averaging that demands genuine skill. It takes into account the prevailing winds of the region, the lay of the land, the habits of shade-loving and moisture-loving plants and their opposites, the tendency of certain plants to point their leaves or their tips persistently in a certain direction, the growth of tree bark as influenced by sun and shade, the nesting habits of certain animals, the morning and evening flight of birds, and other natural phenomena, depending upon the general character of the country traversed. Moreover, in studying any one sign, a nice discrimination must be exercised. Let us glance at a few examples. First, as to the time-honored subject of moss, not confusing real moss with the parasitic lichens that encrust rocks and trees. Moss favors that part of a tree that holds the most moisture, not necessarily the part that receives the most moisture, but the part that retains it longest. Consequently, it grows more abundantly on the upper side of a leaning tree than on the under side, on rough bark than on smooth bark, on top of projecting burls rather than on the lower side, and in the forks of trees and on their buttressed bases. These factors are, of course, independent of the points of the compass. Does it follow, then, that exposure has nothing to do with the growth of moss? Not at all. It merely follows that a competent woodcraftsman, seeking a sign of direction from the moss on trees, would ignore leaning trees, uncommonly rough bark, bossy knots, forks of limbs, and the bases of tree trunks, just as he would give no heed to the growth on prostrate logs. He would single out for examination the straight-shafted old trees of rather smooth bark, knowing that on them there would be fairly even lodgment for moisture all around, and that the wet would evaporate least from the north and northeast sides of the tree as a general rule, and consequently that on those sides the moss would preponderate. He would expect to find such difference more pronounced on the edge of thick forests than in their densely shaded interior. He would give special heed to the evidence of trees that were isolated enough to get direct sunlight throughout a good portion of the day, while those that were in the shade of cliffs or steep mountains so that they could only catch the sunbeams in the morning or the afternoon would be ruled out of court. You see how much more swiftly and surely such a man could reach a decision than could one who tried to take into account all kinds and conditions of trees, regardless of surroundings, and how much less he would have to puzzle over contradictory evidence. Among 100 trees he might only examine 10, but those 10 would be more trustworthy for his purpose than their 90 neighbors. This is woodcraft, the genuine article, as distinguished from the mysterious and infallible sixth sense of direction that, I think, exists nowhere outside of leather stocking tails. A rule that holds good in the main, wherever I have had a chance to study it, is that the feathery tip, the topmost little branch of a towering pine or hemlock, points toward the rising sun, that is to say, a little south of east. There are exceptions, of course, but I have generally found this to be the case in 3/4 of the trees examined, leaving out of consideration those growing in deep, narrow valleys or on wind-swept crests. I do not know whether it is characteristic of all conifers throughout their ranges, but I commend this peculiar phenomenon to travelers for observation. The bark of old trees is generally thicker on the north and northeast sides than on the other sides. A more reliable indicator of direction, though one that a traveler seldom has opportunity to test, is the thickness of annual rings of wood growth, which is more pronounced on the north than on the south side of a tree. This has been noted in widely separated parts of the earth, and has been known for many centuries. More than 400 years ago it was mentioned by Leonardo da Vinci, that universal genius, who was scarcely less celebrated as an engineer and scientist than as an artist and litterateur. "The rings of trees," wrote Leonardo, "show how many years they have lived, and their greater or smaller size shows whether the years were damper or drier. They also show the direction in which they were turned, because they are larger on the north side than on the south. And for this reason the center of the tree is nearer the bark on the south than on the north side. In 1893 this matter was put to a definite test by the New York State Forest Commission, which directed its foresters to examine the regularity of the northward thickening of annual rings in the black spruce of the Adirondacks. The foresters examined 700 trees of varying exposure, noting in each case the compass point toward which the longest radius of wood growth pointed. The result was north 471, northeast 81, east 106. Total north and east 658, 94%. South 1, southeast 0, west 27, southwest 6, northwest 8. Total south and west 42, 6%. These figures deserve more than a passing glance. Some plants show a decided polarity in their habit of growth. The compass plant, or rosinweed, Silphium laciniatum, that once abounded on the prairies of the Mississippi Valley from Minnesota to Texas, is a conspicuous example. It is a tall plant with long, stiff leaves that do not grow horizontally, but with their edges perpendicular. Its natural habitat is the open, shadeless prairie. If plants are examined that grow thus in the open, especially those in the little swales where they are not fully exposed to fierce winds, it will be found that the great majority of them present their radical leaves north and south. The larger flower heads on short, thick stems point, like the hemlock's finger, to the eastward, and show no such tendency to follow the sun towards the west as is characteristic of many plants. I have often used the compass plant as a guide, and never was led astray by it. In fact, the old settlers on the prairies, if they chanced to get lost on a dark night, would get their bearings by feeling the leaves of the compass plant. The closely related prairie dock, Silphium terebinthinaceum, and that troublesome weed known as prickly lettuce, Lactuca scariola, show a similar polarity. This characteristic is lost if the plants are grown where they receive much shade. Of course, terrestrial magnetism has nothing to do with the polarity of plants. It is the sunlight received on the two sides of the leaves alternately that determines their position. I am of the opinion that there are natural compass signs in the forest and on the plain that we are ignorant of, but that were well known to savages in a state of nature. Such men, dependent from childhood upon close observation of their environment, but observation urged by entirely different motives from those of our naturalists, and directed toward different ends, would inevitably acquire a woodland lore different from ours, but quite as thorough in its own way. That they should develop keen perceptive faculties is no more remarkable than that a carpenter should hit a nail instead of the thumb that steadies it. That they should notice and study signs that no modern hunter or scientist would bother his head about is a matter of course. Unquestionably, we have lost many arts of wildcraft that were daily practiced by our ancestors of the Stone Age, just as we have lost their acquaintance with the habits of animals now extinct. Probably no white man of the future will ever equal Jim Bridger as a trailer, and it is but natural to suppose that Bridger himself had superiors among the savages from whom he learned his craft. It is a superficial judgment to rate as an old wives' tale every story of exploits in the past that we cannot at present duplicate. However, we need not go to novelists to find out how such things were done. There is much pleasure to be gained in seeking to recover some of the lost arts of a primitive age, and I believe some profit as well. End of chapter 14.